name is Riaz, and I will be the chairperson of this debate, while Aya will be the timekeeper. In this debate, this speaker will have 8 minutes to make their speech. After 1 minute, the timekeeper will signal once, like this. After this, the debaters on the other team might offer a point of information to the speaker. The debater must stand up when they offer the point of information. The speaker who has the floor might choose to accept or decline the point when it is over. At 7 minutes, the timekeeper will again signal once. And after this, no more point information might be offered to the rest of the speech. At 8 minutes, the timekeeper will make the double signal like this. And after this, the speaker must conclude within a few seconds. There will be also a short break within the end of the speech for the judges to complete their notes. After 6-minute speeches, each team will have the opportunity to make 4-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speakers on each team. No point of information are allowed during this reply speeches. The opposition will make their reply speech first. After 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know that they have 1 minute left. After 4 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. Before the debate begins, I would like to remind you to switch all of the mobile phones and anything else which might disturb the debaters. Should you need to leave or re-enter the room for any reason during the debate, please wait until the end of the speech to do so. Audience members should be aware that they may not participate in the main debate. There will be an opportunity to make a comment after the judges that has left the room at the end of the debate. So ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to introduce our judges for today. They are Ms. Tamara Fernando from Sri Lanka, who is the chair judge for today, and Mr. Klaus Konstantin Kruger from Germany, and Mr. Mark Gabriel from Singapore. In proposition for this debate, we have a team from China. Their first speaker is Mr. Lyndon Lee, their second speaker is Brian Lee, and the third speaker is Matthew Webinson. The reply speech will be delivered by Mr. Brian Lee. While in opposition, we have a team from the United States. The first speaker will be Ella Mikhail, and then the second speaker is Mr. Aditya Aryajar, and the third speaker is Ms. Ellie Grossman. And the reply speech will be delivered by Mrs. Ella Mikhail. The motion of this debate is this House believes that states should be able to prioritize asylum seekers on the basis of cultural similarity with the existing population. So ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to invite the first speaker from the proposition team. Please welcome Mr. Lyndon Lee.
It's saddening that refugees in the status quo go into a nation seeking asylum, yet due to different arbitrary factors are not able to integrate into society when they sought better lives or are discriminated in all spheres of life. What we allow on our side is we allow the prioritization of people and to better the lives of refugees in these nations to fulfill their desires to seek asylum and achieve better lives than they did beforehand. Which is why we are proud to stand by the stance that this is a legitimate state choice for states to do so. Before moving on to stat we'd just like to clarify 4 things. Firstly, on what cultural similarity is. We're talking about similarities based on these similar cultural norms within existing populations in which people are best able to adapt. That's to say there are different things like linguistic similarities or religious similarities that may provide certain benefits for refugees in these certain nations. In Ukraine, for example, if there are Ukrainians that can speak Russian, then we say that the Russian government can prioritize to accept these people over others. Next, on the clarification. No, thank you. We like to note that this debate is a value debate, and it is whether states reserve this right to do so. We still say that states do have these humanitarian systems of acceptance, and that they do believe that they do not want to adopt this metric, and it's perfectly legitimate for them to do so. That is to say, if Germany and Sweden do believe that the Syrian refugees really do need help, then it's legitimate for them to not adopt this metric of prioritization as we are participating in.
Sir.
No, thank you. Note that this is different from things like the Syrian refugee crisis if the cultures of people are polar opposites. That's to say, if I'm a Muslim person going into a Western liberal democracy and our ideas are very different, then states don't necessarily have to adopt this metric. No, thank you, when they have refugees. Note that this is also already existing in places like Russia, where they choose to prioritize Ukrainian refugees that speak Russian over other refugees that do not. Next, our stance. Two things under this. Firstly, in no way does this value take away from the state obligation to accept refugees. We still recognize that there does remain a humanitarian obligation for these states to do so. But secondly, we'd like to note that crucially, we are not passing a judgment on the moral value of refugees. Essentially what we're doing is the value we're trying to promote is to maximize the popular acceptance of refugees and the political will of people within those existing populations to do so. Note that it's not our burden to provide the best solution, but moreover, why this is a legitimate solution. No, thank you. Given that, three things are suspended. Firstly, on the principle why states, given that they fulfill their humanitarian obligations to accept refugees, have a right to decide whether they want to prioritize in this fashion. Secondly, why this betters the lives for refugees. And thirdly, which my second speaker, Brian, will extend on, why this is better for refugees that already exist, that already live in these existing nations. So firstly, on the principle, we say that states have the right to decide who comes to their borders, given that they fulfill their humanitarian obligations. As we clarify in our stance, we say that states have to fulfill a baseline humanitarian obligation and that they should not shy away from accepting refugees. However, we say that once they do, the legitimacy of the state as a sovereign actor means that they do have this right to accept it, because they do have control of what goes on in their borders and the people that they want to accept. To analogize, if I'm donating to a charity, I can donate my $100 to any charity I want as long as I'm paying the same amount. It's just whatever thing I believe best suits my interests. That's the analogy we put to today. We think that if opposition wants to say that, oh, these things are arbitrary, we think that the refugee crisis and these selections are already arbitrary in the first place. The fact that some refugees got on boats to get to these different nations in the first place, or they got selected by these means of application, means that these things are also morally arbitrary. So we say that states, as sovereign actors, hold this obligation because once they do so, they have the right to choose who they want to help in that instance.
Sir,
Before I move on, yes.
would you prioritize immigration status based on cultural similarity to a country?
Yes, we would, because we think that it doesn't take away from people immigrating. Moreover, if it shows that there's the best side of immigration, and I'm going to elaborate to you about what this is better for people coming in from foreign nations and better for the lives of refugees. The second point is substantive. We put to you that in the status quo, things like xenophobia and anti-refugee rhetoric are endemic in certain developing nations. That's why there's been a surge of populist movements in this year. For example, in Brexit, when Britain pulled out the European Union because they did not want to forward the idea of free movement and accept these refugees. Or Le Pen, like in France, no thank you, that rose to power on a platform and was one of the final London elections, given that she ran on this populist xenophobic platform. We put to you that people stand at the root of xenophobia in the status quo, and that whenever you allow the prioritization of social norms, that's when you allow better integration and better lives for refugees in the status quo. Note that on their side of the house, when they do not allow refugees to integrate, we think that the idea of asylum seeking is pointless because they are not able to achieve better lives by virtue of the discrimination that they face. Two reasons under this. Firstly, we say that refugees are largely unable to integrate in the status quo, and that states have the obligation to maximize the possibility of achieving the best life for asylum seekers. Currently, there are different things like barriers that prevent these people from achieving their right to liberty, like language barriers that result in workplace discrimination, where these people are ostracized into enclaves where they are not able to integrate, and there are people willingly electing in politicians that work directly against the interests of these refugees. But secondly, the people's will and the general perception means that these people means that they are less likely to get the amount of change on their side of the house. We'd say that currently, the general popular perceptions towards refugees is that they are terrorists because of the perception that they see in the media. When you have these different things and you allow people to integrate by prioritizing the people that are most likely to be able to be integrated into these social norms, that's when you have the prioritization that is better for the lives of refugees. That's why the US elected populist rhetoric in Trump, and they were able to pass the Muslim ban by virtue of the fact that people saw these terrorist attacks happening on the other side in Europe, and that's why the political will is directly skewed against these people. Why then are perceptions changed on our side? We say that when you see a visible immigrant that is similar towards you, you are more likely to be accepting of more foreign people, that foreignly immigrate. And here's why it clashes directly with their POI. Because we say at the point at which you do not allow people to associate with people that are polar opposites towards these social norms that they grow up with, that is when it's more likely for these refugees to be oppressed and for them to get their livelihoods eliminated. Two reasons why this change in perception is better on our side. Firstly, because political will, no thank you, is better on our side because you are able to vote in politicians that are more inclined to better the lives of these people. The general change that you get when you elect in congressmen or presidents that are willing to elect different humanitarian change that has general benefits towards refugees and that are generally more inclusive of these people means that you have more political capital and you're able to cater towards these groups. We say in the status quo there's a political stigma towards immigration, and you eliminate that when you change the perceptions of people towards refugees. But secondly, it allows for gradual change. We say that when you begin to see immigrations as a group that you can associate with because they have similar norms like languages or religions, that is when it is more likely for these people to solve the issue at its root cause. That is to say, people are the reason why this discrimination is perpetuated, and when you begin to have these people who are more similar to them, that is when they are able to associate in a better manner. Change means that they begin to accept them, and there are less crimes and discrimination against them. We put to you that refugees seek asylum to improve their lives. But in the status quo, states prevent that because they are unable to integrate and they are seen as people, as intrusions on the state. We want to destroy that narrative, never be proud to propose. Thank you.
Yeah.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for their speech, and now to open the case from the opposition side of this house. Please welcome Ms.
Since 2011, the Syrian refugee crisis has killed hundreds of thousands of people. That conflict has displaced millions of people, forcing them to flee their homes and the violence and persecution that they would face in their home nation. Syrian refugees and millions like them exist across the world. On the opposition, we stand against the government both in this debate and, interestingly, in our home country, when we deny that governments have the right to deny these Syrians and millions of others like them their right to life and liberty on the basis of their identity. For that reason, we're so proud to oppose. Before rebutting the proposition case and introducing our first 2 substantive arguments on how their policy is both principally abhorrent and threatens the lives of refugees, I would just like to clarify a couple of things in this round. A couple of things. First of all, this motion demands that the proposition prove that denying asylum seekers based on their identity is both principally permissible and beneficial for asylum seekers and society at large. But furthermore, on our side of the house, our stance is that we don't think it's legitimate to reject asylum seekers on the basis of identity. We absolutely recognize that asylum seekers may not receive ideal treatment in their host countries, and we don't defend that, and in fact advocate for policies that would undermine those realities. Things like in Germany and Turkey, stronger wage protections and laws against hate crimes that have recently been implemented. We recognize that neither world is perfect, but we think this debate is about the comparative. Is it better for refugees to be denied the right to life and liberty, or maybe face a little bit of xenophobia? That's the comparative here, and we think we take the debate overwhelmingly. Now let's move on into rebutting the propositions case. So just one thing on framing, we think that their idea of determining cultural norms is seriously arbitrary and gives governments a lot of room for interpretation to essentially reject any group that is marginally different from what they view to be acceptable. But they essentially had two arguments in today's round, right? First, on the principle of government's right to make value judgments, even when it results in people literally dying. And second, on essentially somehow denying people their right to asylum is better for asylum seekers. Let's talk about the principle first. First, they say that just so long as states fulfill their obligation to protect humanitarian rights, they should be able to deny whoever they want and select refugees however they would like. This is obviously contingent on them proving that states do in fact fulfill this humanitarian obligation, something that they never really do. Countries systematically reject refugees offhand. They are not fulfilling that obligation. But second, this is essentially contingent on the idea that this value judgment is a legitimate one for these governments to make, something that we would contest. And finally, we would say that people's right to life, their right not to face persecution and actual death in the countries that they come from, trumps any right that the government has to arbitrarily discriminate on the basis of identity. And finally, we would say that the value judgment that they advocate for is illegitimate, because what exactly are they saying? They're saying that certain people don't deserve to be let into these countries on the basis of something that they cannot control. That's completely illegitimate because there is nothing inherent about these people that makes them in any way less valuable than the people that this government is preferring. But second on their argument about what is best for asylum seekers and how this somehow creates a better policy. We think it's, first of all, a false comparative between maybe xenophobia and literally dying in the country in which you come from. And that in our world, even though there might be a little bit of xenophobia, that is vastly, vastly preferable. But second, they essentially say that people become more friendly towards immigration because immigrants look like you. We don't think the fundamental problem here is a stance against immigrants. It's a stance against people who look different than you, something they perpetuate on their side of the house when they isolate people culturally and never actually expose them to other groups of individuals. And third, we would say that actually on our side of the house, increasing contact with individuals that don't look like you actually decreases the very discrimination that they condemn on their side of the house. Because if you never come into contact with groups that don't look like you, you are always going to assume that your group is superior because everyone else is just different and thus lesser. But finally, they talked about the political consequences of immigration and how we create more anti-immigrant policy. Interestingly, the politicians that they talk about on their side of the house that would deny immigrants their rights are exactly the kind that they advocate for, that would discriminate against people arbitrarily. But now let's introduce the first substantive argument from side opposition on how their policy is principally abhorrent. But before I explain this, go.
So on both of our sides, we recognize that some people can't get in, and on both of our sides, we accept the same amount of people. How do you choose who gets into your country on your side?
Okay, we think that it is much more legitimate both for states to not discriminate on identity, but if they absolutely have to prioritize based on who faces the most legitimate threat, not on something that no one can control when they are born. But their policy is principally abhorrent for three reasons. First, it increases discrimination. What is the proposition's advocacy? It's saying that we should select asylum seekers based on cultural similarity and explicitly exclude those who don't fit racial, religious, and cultural norms. Gee, that sounds a lot like discrimination. And I feel strange that I have to ask this question in today's debate, but why is discrimination principally bad? First, we think that denying someone rights because of something they can't control is just wrong. Everyone is where they are in life essentially because of random factors. Someone who was born in the UK doesn't control the fact that they were born there, just as a citizen of Syria doesn't control the fact that they were born in a war-torn country, and we don't believe in punishing people for arbitrary factors that they cannot control. But second, through their policy, the state is tacitly endorsing cultural superiority by prioritizing and privileging certain groups, and which essentially expresses a preference for those groups. Regardless of the intention of this policy, we think it tacitly endorses a certain degree of cultural superiority and discrimination. But second, their argument decreases democratic legitimacy. States are given a considerable amount of power to restrict natural rights, something that's only legitimate if they don't arbitrarily discriminate against certain groups. Their discrimination is completely arbitrary because there's, as we established, nothing inherent about these certain certain refugees that makes them less valuable than others, and by arbitrarily denying the value of certain groups, states are undermining the moral legitimacy of denying natural rights to their citizens. But finally, we think that this is an international issue that demands international responsibility. The conflicts these asylum seekers are part of transcend national borders. The Syrian refugee crisis affects many countries across the world, and thus the obligation to address this crisis transcends national boundaries as well, and thus states have an obligation to do so without discriminating against people. But now let's talk about our second argument on how this threatens the lives of refugees. First, let's talk about immediate losses. What happens when we implement this policy? We make it harder for refugees to find a country that's going to accept them. Take the example of Hungary, where that country essentially only accepts Christian refugees, which are factually not the majority of refugees. This leads to three things. First, refugees are forced to languish on camps on the borders of countries. Women in these camps are much more prone to sexual assault, they're immensely overcrowded, rampant with disease, and people systematically die within these horrible institutions. Second, they can be sent home back to the country that was so dangerous that they risked life and liberty in order to escape it. But third, they'll be afraid to leave their countries in the first place, countries where they legitimately face the threat of death, because they don't think they're going to be able to find a country that is willing to accept them. But second, we think there are long-term losses because you overwhelmingly decrease the number of refugees that countries are willing to accept. In the status quo, countries don't want to help people that are not like them. And when we legitimize their ability to do that, they're much more likely to capitalize it and systematically deny people rights and their right to life. For all of these reasons, because we never legitimize discrimination or death in the name of protecting sovereignty, we are so proud to oppose.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes and 22 seconds.
I would like the first opposition speaker for their speech, and now to continue the case from the opposition, please welcome Mr. Brian.
Panel, 64 million people all around the world are stateless refugees or asylum seekers. But the problem that they face is not the fact that they are not being accepted and discriminated as they would like to frame. The problem that they are facing today is the fact that the West is unwilling to accept them because of the prejudices that already exist. It is not in this debate about the fact that the West is just not going to accept them as a whole, but the fact that the anti-refugee stigmas around them, the elitist views of the individuals within these countries that are propagated by their anti-refugee rhetoric means that they're unwilling to accept these people. Their problem is that they continue to perpetuate the status quo, which is that Western media takes advantage of the fact that they can disparage any of these ill actions to be blamed upon refugees. The fact that they can perpetuate this rhetoric means that on their side, the problem is never solved, but only continued in a world where the refugees are being denied on face because of this anti-West, anti-refugee sentiment. Two things in my speech. Firstly, rebuttals, and then on why this helps the refugees within these countries. 4 responses they said to our proposition. The first response they told us is this impact rating on the comparative. They told us that the comparative was between refugees living in a xenophobic world or them dying on face. Note that that is not today's debate. Today's debate is not whether or not these nations should be accepting refugees, but the premise under which that they should be accepting them. Given this, you must understand that we are not saying that these Western countries should not be accepting these refugees, but that when they are given a choice and there is an overflow in refugees overall, that they are given the privilege to be able to decide which refugees are going to be accepted. So the real comparison is that on their side, they're going to randomly and arbitrarily accept refugees based off of who gets on that lifeboat first. On our side, we're still going to be arbitrarily determining, but we're determining based off of the factor of whether or not they can actually culturally identify and they're willing to integrate properly with our society, which we tell you has a lot of pragmatic benefits in terms of long-term capability of taking refugees in as a whole. Second thing they told us, that states are going to abuse this policy. Note the fact that this is not a policy debate. This is a value debate. Why is this so important? This means that we're assuming that if this motion is going to be carried out in the most legitimate of possible ways, that we are going to evaluate whether or not the values are going to be acceptable. That is to say, we're not talking about whether or not states are going to abuse this policy, but if this policy is going to be adequately used, whether or not that is justified. They cannot push this burden to us, especially if they accept that this is a value debate. Third thing that they told us, that on faith, that it is bad to deny people. Two things. Firstly, we tell you that countries are always going to be arbitrarily deciding who gets accepted into their country. Whether it be a prioritization of who gets onto the lifeboat first, who applies for the application first, we think these measures are always going to be arbitrary. But secondly, importantly, when they concede to the fact that their metric of decision is going to be on who's most vulnerable, we would concede that if your entire metric is going to be based on which side produces more utility, we would submit the fact that if you choose the refugees that are going to be more adept at culturally joining your country, you do actually prioritize utility on our side. Note very carefully that we're not saying that you can accept, that you can deny refugees, but when you are going to accept a specific quota of refugees, that you should be able to preferentiate between which refugees you are choosing. Fourth rebuttal, they told us that we're going to be ostracizing, that ostracization is worse without interaction. That is a generic argument about why it is you solve racial issues, not about why you solve refugee, like anti-refugee rhetoric. I'll explain later why this is so important in my substantive, right? 2 points that they brought to us in substantive. Firstly, they told us about arbitrariness and cultural superiority. Firstly, as I've already noted, literally everything in the decision-making is going to be arbitrary. They need to discern why this is so dramatically different that it is unacceptable. But secondly, when they don't respond to any of Lyndon's analysis on why on the long term we accept more refugees because we destroy this about the amount of anti-refugee rhetoric, they need to show us why it is that discrimination is so bad that it means that even if you take necessarily less refugees, it's still justified. We would say that the metric in this debate should more so be about who can save more refugees rather than who does so in a less discriminatory way, right? But thirdly, note the fact that this is not an issue of cultural superiority, but rather more the ability to construct your country in the way that it becomes more friendly to refugees on the long term, right? And then fourthly, when they tell us about international responsibility, sure, all countries have a responsibility to take in refugees. We don't try to fight back against that, and that is not the crux of today's debate. It is to say that they're trying to fulfill their international responsibility in the exact same way, whether or not it is justified that they get to assess their own value metrics on societal, cultural similarity, right? Second point they told us on this threatens like people that are not going to be accepted, right? They gave us the example of how Turkey only accepts Christians. Firstly, note the fact that Turkey recently had an agreement with the UN that they're accepting literally every refugee that goes into Greece, right? But secondly, note the fact that refugee camps exist on both sides. So if all of the harm they're going to point out to us is the fact that refugee camps are so miserable for people, note the fact that on both sides, we're still going to have refugee camps on their side, right? The important factor is that people who are taken out of these refugee camps are more likely going to culturally assimilate, which is going to be more beneficial for all refugees on the long term. So that's a transition into my point of substantive. Why this helps the refugees on the inside. In the status quo, as Lyndon has already told you, there's a general narrative against refugees. That is to say, they're often discriminated and ostracized in very xenophobic conditions. Often they cannot find jobs, or legally they're given much less status because of the simple fact that they're a refugee. Not because of their unique differences in and within themselves, but because they are a refugee. What I'm going to add to this is why this is a self-serving cycle within the status quo. Note this, refugee status is something that is incredibly tensions and brings a lot of scrutiny. That is to say, we recognize the fact that not all refugees are the same. There are some refugees that are necessarily potentially going to break laws, but there are at the same time refugees that are not going to do so. The problem with the status quo is that every mistake made by a refugee is scrutinized to the point in which the media blows them up to be committing crimes, to be doing these acts because they are refugees. All of this generalization causes an increase in amount of discrimination when it comes towards these refugees, and it is extremely important that they essentially generalize and dehumanize the ability for these refugees to be discerned from one another. Before that, yeah.
Would you allow companies, or would you allow countries to expel non-native born people because of cultural differences?
That's just not an accurate comparison, right? We're telling you why when you choose people on the long term, you get more people getting accepted, right? So maybe yes, if you are going to have to choose between one immigrant and the other immigrant, and one of them leads to more long-term benefits, we would submit that you can choose the one with better long-term benefits. But back to my substantive. Why does this break down the dehumanization? For two things. Firstly, we tell you that there's a larger amount of culturally similar refugees. It means it slowly breaks down the idea that all refugees are going to be bad people. That is to say, on their exact same point on when you can interact with refugees who are nicer and more compatible people and the people that you're less likely to have immediate disgust reactions to, we think there's going to be larger and more assimilation on the long term. But secondly, we think that this humanizes people on the long term as well, right? Crime no longer is going to be because you are a refugee, but more importantly because you're an individual who committed crime. This is vastly important because refugees largely have a lower status than normal civilians under the status quo, right? We think this means that there's largely going to be a self-serving cycle on the long term, something that has to be stopped by this sort of humanization, right? This becomes incredibly important on the long term when you try to save more refugees because you want the country to accept them rather than dehumanize them. So proud to propose.
Okay.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
I'll thank the second proposition speaker for the speech, and now to continue the case of the opposition, I would like to call Mr. Aditya Dar.
Okay. Proposition stance on changing perspectives is this. A right-wing Christian who sees a Christian refugee now loves all immigrants and all refugees. On face, their narrative is fundamentally flawed when Ella tells you at the beginning of Opposition 1 that we don't think it's an anti-refugee sentiment, but it's a sentiment against people who look differently than you. Their stance does absolutely nothing to change that, but we'll take their best-case scenario and we'll refute it anyway. 3 things in this speech. First, a quick clarification on our stance about how many refugees we're going to accept. Then, 2 questions of rebuttal on the principle and practical before giving our third argument about intercultural conflict. First, they come to you with the idea that somehow both sides take the same number of refugees. Reject that narrative on face. What do we tell you? Since Hungary adopted its prioritization of Christian refugee policy, it hasn't taken any refugees other than Christians, and it's dramatically decreased the number of refugees that it's taken overall. But second, we would also note that when you're taking in asylum seekers, you're not actually taking in the ones in danger. Take the example of Russia that they gave you. That's pretty much their only hypothetical example in this round. When Russia is the one persecuting Ukrainians that don't speak the same language as Russia, we think if they're going to take in like Russian language speaking Ukrainians, they're not taking in the ones that actually face danger within that society. But third, a question that side government needs to answer. If you are an ethnic minority that doesn't have a broader state to fit into, where do you go? Where would the Jews have gone before Israel? Where do the Yazidi Christians wind up? We think that government needs to answer this question because at that point, there are going to be asylum seekers that they leave out of this debate. We think our side helps those people. So first, let's talk about the principle. What is the principle that we stood for in this round? We told you discrimination was bad because it denied people equal opportunity. We said you're denying people rights based on morally arbitrary factors. We said there's a tacit endorsement of cultural superiority. We said it's an international issue. What was the extent of Proposition's rebuttal? They were saying it's not tacit discrimination, it's not building cultural superiority, it's about building a state that assumes that has a friendlier refugee environment. On face, reject this narrative. No, when you create homogenized communities, it's about building a state where everyone looks exactly the same. We would say that's inherently dangerous, but second, note that the only principal response is contingent on them proving that it's a friendlier refugee environment. More on this in the second question. What is the principle that we get? What is the principle that they stand for? It is literally just states, because they fulfill humanitarian obligations, can somehow choose which people they're deciding to pick from, right? Ellen tells you first you need the burden of proof to show you that states fulfill their humanitarian obligations. I just gave you 3 reasons why they didn't. But second, we don't think this is a legitimate judgment because what it is doing is it is passing value judgments on minorities, on refugees, the very thing they said their policy wasn't going to do, right? Why is this so? At the point where the state is literally saying, You are culturally similar. You are better for my country. Note that they literally use the word utility in their speech. They're literally saying that people who have cultural similarities are better for utility than other refugees. We think what effectively happens is you're passing a value judgment on your minorities, and you're literally doing what they themselves say you don't want to do. But take them at their highest ground. Let's say you have this arbitrary principle that states can choose. We would say at the point where you deny refugees the right to life, and the state is literally tacitly discriminating against people, it is principally unjust. Let's go to the practical. We think government is massively behind on the practical at the point where their literal only response to our second argument is, quote, well, it's just a generic argument about how you solve racism. Great! So our side solves racism. Their side does not. I think that's a win for side opposition in this round, but let's talk about the practical arguments that government gives you in this round. They say they have two. First about better lives, and second about this idea that refugees aren't going to face media scrutiny anymore. That's not two separate arguments. That's literally one insofar that they brought up the same media scrutiny in their first speech, right? Let's tackle this on the face. First, they tell you that there are structural barriers that don't allow refugees to integrate. What are those barriers? They give you one, a language barrier. Look, language barriers are not a reason to stop refugees from immigrating. I am confused as to how my grandparents and my parents would have been allowed to immigrate to the United States if there were language barriers. But second, we think if anything, it's a reason to give refugees language retraining programs. Why is our side the stance that solves for that? We tell you in opposition to one that we'd stand for things like refugee protections within the society, right? Like they never give you any reasons that can't be surmounted by government support. Moreover, we tell you that independent of government support, for example, 300,000 Vietnamese refugees integrated into the United States in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s without literally a penny in American government support. We don't think that refugees need all these, we think that refugees are very easily able to surmount all these barriers, right? But here is their narrative. Their narrative is literally just, if a refugee looks more like you, the media is far less likely to say, they're committing crimes because they're a refugee. First, we see that's absolutely not true. Like we see in the status quo, for example, in Denmark, even when you have similar refugees, they're still called out for being refugees. But second, take them at their highest ground. What does this do for broader anti-minority sentiment, which is what we say actually exists? It does absolutely nothing. At the point where the only people you're helping are people who look exactly like you, we say that you're not contributing to the real problem, which is structural discrimination against people who do not look like you. They have no practical offense in this round. Let's go to our third argument about increasing intercultural conflict. 3 levels under this. First, emboldening reactionary policies. We see this happens for 2 reasons. First, the state endorsement legitimizes views that are in most states considered far-right and reactionary. Why do we say this is so? At the point where the state is literally saying some refugees are better than the other because of their cultural similarity, we think it is literally the state endorsing ethnic superiority. But second, we would say that homogenous communities literally feed narratives of ethnic superiority. What does this do? It increases an atmosphere of hate, so you see more hate crimes, and as such you also see the election of populist racist leaders that decrease minority protections in the long run. We think this affects both minorities and long-term refugees within the host country. Second, we think this fuels radical narratives because this is seen outside the country as a state oppressing minority groups. We think this is used by terrorists as propaganda. ISIS, for example, already used Trump's call for a Muslim ban as proof that USA hates Muslims and is oppressing them. This has increased radicalization and increased the flow of foreign fighters towards the Islamic State. But what is the comparative? Thanks for offering the PLI.
How do you reduce this populist rhetoric and these perceptions on your side when people still generalize refugees as people that are not able to integrate into society?
I'm going to get to that when we talk about heterogeneous communities. That brings us to the point about the comparative, right? What does our side mean? It means that the state isn't endorsing views of ethnic superiority. We say that's good because you're not endorsing reactionary policies. But second, we say that there's nothing to fuel radical narratives. But third, this is where we get into the clash with their third argument. We think when you have heterogeneous communities, what you do is you decrease the feelings of ethnic superiority. When you see refugees, more importantly, when you see people who are different from you as neighbors, classmates, co-workers, teachers, and friends, we think it's very important. Why is contact with people different from you important? First, it allows you to learn about other cultures, and second, it allows you to break down stereotypes. Stereotypes never break down, this is their third argument, stereotypes never break down on their side of the house insofar that you're not actually engaging with people who are different in culture than you. It's literally just the same person. So what do we think this actually looks like? It looks like the Irish in America, who faced backlash because they were far different and they faced discrimination from the Anglo-American populace. When you break down stereotypes, you decrease racism, you decrease violence, and you increase acceptance. At the end of the day, their side does absolutely nothing to redress historical discrimination. Our side is the one that seeks change for them.
Okay.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for their speech, and now to continue the case from the opposition, I call upon Mr. Matthew Williamson.
Panel, saying a principle 70 times within 3 speeches in many, many different ways with nice rhetoric doesn't make it a viable principle. Similarly, we think that maximizing utility should be a viable principle within this debate, and we think that just claiming that something is discriminatory isn't enough to win you the debate. Let's address the 3 clashes. Firstly, on why this is legitimate. Secondly, on how we get more refugees on our side and why that's important. And thirdly, how we get better lives for these people. Firstly, this is legitimate because they tell you, and this is the extent of their analysis, right, that it's arbitrary whether or not you were born in Europe or the Middle East or somewhere else, or whether you are able to culturally integrate. We agree that this is arbitrary. However, note that we've told you down our line that other methods of selecting, as we told you, are also arbitrary. Methods like, for example, did you get on the boat from Libya to Europe? Methods like, for example, were you able to escape the people at the border? Methods, for example, like saying, do you have enough money to get here? Do you have connections to get here? We'd say that these are all arbitrary things, but that doesn't prevent us from letting certain people in and letting certain people out. Everything, if you recognize it, is to a certain extent arbitrary. The fact that I was born in a certain place or another is arbitrary. That means then that this isn't grounds enough for discrimination, for a principle against certain. What we say then is that they haven't proven a concrete harm to this type of selection by states, which we've told you is legitimate. Because we told you from the start of the speech that if you are given a principle that you need to donate to some kind of humanitarian aid, that you need to donate this $100, we think the states do have this obligation. And at the point in which we recognize that we are still having the same amount of utility, and we are accepting the same amount of people, we think that's principally legitimate for states to be able to try to maximize utility within that type of framework. Ultimately, what they tried to tell us in response to this was, we're going to take less refugees on our side. Firstly, recognize that they didn't understand the motion. This House believes that states should be able to prioritize asylum seekers on the basis of cultural integration. That doesn't mean that we accept less people somehow on our side. It says prioritize, not get rid of the rest. Clearly that means they lose on that point. But furthermore, note that we've told you down our line how you get more refugees on our side. Let's do some weighing here. Sure, there may be some type of discrimination on our side, but we recognize that that's already arbitrary, and there are many other arbitrary factors. For example, as we see in Germany right now, where they accept Syrian refugees, but not Afghani refugees. If they want to engage in the real world, what they realistically have to support are other types of discriminatory policies. At the very least, we get this type of benefit on our side, not at this time. But on the pro side, we say that it's much more important than some kind of ideological win that we actually get people into these camps, get people into these countries, and that we maximize the ability to do so. If we accept their characterization from the first speech that we need to give everyone the right to life as much as possible, then they don't win on that at all because they haven't proven any kind of practical benefit. Yes?
Your idea about increasing the number of long-term refugees assumes that sentiment for refugees goes up, but you never tell us why exactly people are far more inclined to look at someone culturally dissimilar to them and say, well, you seem like a nice person, especially in a world where you literally shut them out.
So here's the thing, right? We told you from the start that there's a spectrum of cultural similarity. that someone far away from you with a completely different religion and a completely different language is someone that you won't identify with that much. We say that accepting people that are more culturally similar to you opens people up to the idea of refugees as a political idea. Now this moves me into my second clash actually, so I'll do that. We told you from the first place that we at least give them more ability to accept refugees on our side, even if you accept their status quo. Because presumably, Hungary and Russia would not be accepting any types of refugees if you didn't allow them to accept Christian refugees. We say that's a benefit on that for us at the very least. But furthermore, we would note that you get more future political capital on our side. Why? Because we told you uniquely about the idea of cognitive dissonance. That is, if you force change onto people too radically and too quickly, you get massive amounts of backlash. That's why Sweden, initially one of the most refugee-friendly countries, is now experiencing a lot of backlash in terms of internal politics and the rise of right-wing populist movements. Why? Because we saw that refugees were forced on them too quickly and too culturally dissimilarly. This allowed a few things. Firstly, it meant the dehumanization of these people because you only see them in the poorest of areas, getting the poorest of jobs, doing the and you only see the worst out of things out of them. But furthermore, we told you that this allows for a narrative to be created out in the media, spinning them as the true evil within within these countries. We told you that even though these types of refugees are statistically unlikely and less likely to commit crimes, they are still sensationalized by the media because whenever a refugee who came in on your country's merit commits a crime, they are more likely to be demonized on our side. However, we said that this was uniquely because they are less culturally similar to us, because we are less likely to discriminate against people who we identify with more personally, who we say are culturally more similar. Ultimately, what this means then is that bringing in people who are able to culturally assimilate better means that you get a better view of these people. A few mechanisms we gave for this. First, you recognize these refugees as people that you can communicate with about things that you care about. A shared taste in music or language or culture means that you can communicate with them more as humans rather than someone you pity or that your country accepted arbitrarily. But furthermore, this denies the myth that these types of refugees are fundamentally different people, which is often perpetuated by this type of right-wing media. Because what it tells you then is that these people are coming in and that they can be similar to you and that you can draw connections to them. Note that this happens more on our side when people are more culturally similar to the existing population. They don't get that type of benefit on their side. Furthermore, it minimizes the criticism of so-called refugee terrorists. As I noted earlier, these types of things happen exclusively when you can point to a person and say they are very dissimilar, they don't share the same types of values, they are of this religion or of this language or of this value system, and therefore we can blame them for this. When you have someone who is also Christian, also speaks English, also potentially looks similar to you, you cannot not similarly blame them for the exact same reasons. We think that you humanize refugees and you get better acceptance on our side. But finally, we think that refugee acceptance should be an uncontroversial issue as much as possible. That is to say, at least on our side, you don't get the amount of media buzz because these people just aren't so radically different from you. We think that at the point when you make this a contentious and controversial issue, it takes away the uniquely humanitarian and good perspective of this type of humanitarian aid, and we think that making it controversial always harms in terms of humanitarian aid. That's why in the US, where it is a more contentious issue than say in Germany or previously in Nordic states, where they just commonly accepted it as a human right, refugee status is often contested because it is controversial and it is brought up. That makes the other side inflated, it makes it terrible on their side. But finally, why do we ensure better lives for refugees and why is this so crucial? Because we told you from the start that there must be a utilitarian measure for what we do. Because when we are trying to achieve a utilitarian goal, we should try to use utilitarian means and use utilitarian way. So if we recognize that some people will be better able to use this type of resource and better able to access the type of lives that we have on our side, we should try to prioritize that because there is more net benefit then. We say that then, even if this person in a refugee camp outside of your country will be equally harmed as another person, if this person can better access goods and resources within your countries, better bring benefits to themselves, better bring benefits to others, we say that they should be prioritized. Why specifically do these people tend to be more benefited by this situation? Firstly, because of things like the language barrier and things like cultural assimilation, which means that you can get better job prospects, better university prospects, better schooling prospects, and integrate more with the community and be generally accepted. Note that it's not enough for them to say that this is discriminatory, therefore it's automatically bad, because we're still okay with accepting other people. Crucially, what they didn't recognize with our case is that we accept as many people as possible, but we recognize that we should maximize utility. On their side, they stand for an abstract principle that doesn't create concrete benefits. We stand for something that actually gets more refugees. Incredibly proud to propose.
what does side opposition have to do to win today's round? First, they have to prove that their advocacy is principally correct. Now, we're a little confused on their stance here because the first two speakers say this is a values debate, but then the second speaker says that their principle is utility, which isn't a practical argument. Let's not make any mistakes here. But second, they have to prove that it is practically beneficial to both refugees and the country as a whole in order to pick and choose refugees as they wish. What do we have to do? We do not have to support other forms of discriminatory policy. Rather, what we've told you down the bench is that all we stand for is not picking and choosing refugees. We can still support better refugee policy like we outlined to you has happened in Turkey. So with that, let's dive into the comparative in today's round. Let's look at what both worlds look like. So, what is their world? In their world, countries are allowed to select refugees like menu items based on their utility. We think, first of all, that's incredibly dehumanizing to treat refugees like tools. They're the only ones doing dehumanization on their side of the house. But second, we tell you they decrease refugee entry. A couple of reasons. First, we tell you that often this is a way that countries use an excuse to decrease their refugee acceptance in the long run, like we've seen in Hungary, which is accepting way fewer refugees now that they have a Christians-only policy. But second, we tell you, take them at their highest ground and say countries are still opening their doors to a high number of refugees. We don't think that reflects the need across the world. So if Europe bans all Muslim refugees on the basis of cultural similarity, even if they theoretically will accept more Christians, that still leaves literally millions of Muslim people with nowhere to go anymore. That's why they decrease acceptance. But furthermore, we would tell you, in the long run, justifying this hatred enables countries to destroy themselves. Like, for example, Europe needs the influx of Muslim refugees they've been having because they have an aging crisis. We would say, if they want to talk about utility, that's utility. We should not allow blind hatred to destroy both refugees and countries. But the second issue under here is, what does our world look like? We tell you, you accept more refugees because you are not picking and choosing them based on the arbitrary basis of identity. But furthermore, we tell you all refugees have somewhere to go. That's really important because, as Aditya brings up, not all refugees fit into some certain country. There's no Yazidi country or Yazidi religion in a country outside of where they are. So if every country shuts its doors, we don't know how they expect people to find a new home. Those people are left languishing on the border. But furthermore, we tell you in our third argument, which they refuse to engage with, that refugees do integrate. They do become part of the community. That is when you see xenophobia decrease, not when you enable it. So, first core question of today's round on that note is, which side is principally correct? So, what do we tell you? We tell you it's incredibly unjust to discriminate against refugees on basis of identity. A few reasons. First, we tell you that things like racism and Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination are incredibly arbitrary. Like, borders are arbitrary, people are not. What do they tell you? That it's also arbitrary how we accept people now. A few problems there. First of all, we would tell you, I don't know how they expect either side of the house to solve this. There's no way countries can accept refugees that didn't get on the boat. But second, that doesn't legitimate government giving thumbs up to ethnic supremacy and only accepting refugees on that basis. But third, we would tell you, even if the result of who gets on the boat is arbitrary, their very decision-making process is arbitrary and based on judgments, based on identity. We find that worse. But second, we tell you they're essentially endorsing cultural superiority on their side of the house when governments say some refugees are more valuable than others, some refugees are more equal than others and deserve more of a chance to live and rebuild their lives. But third, we tell you the idea of sovereignty and countries having the right to make individual choices falls when problems are international and not confined to one country. The refugee crisis is international. It's not a matter of individual countries. That's why this argument falls. What do they say? They say it's acceptable for countries to pick and choose. A few problems here. First of all, when they set this up, they assume that they meet their burden of countries accepting the exact same number of refugees. They've never done that. They didn't engage with Aditya's arguments on why that's not true. Second, we tell you the idea of sovereignty is surpassed by the fact that this is an international problem. That is why they do not win the principle in today's round. That is incredibly crucial because we tell you states should be moral actors. They've been given vast power, and the only reason that power is legitimate is when they use it to good ends, to protect the people of the world, especially those that have lost citizenship and protection in their own country. But what is the second core question of today's round? It's which side is best for refugees, but before I get into it, I'll take a point.
At the dawn of the United States, immigrants from all around the world flowed in immediately and in immense numbers. This caused massive backlash against, for example, Irish and Asian immigrants, eventually causing intense discrimination against these people. Generational change could solve this.
Yeah, it does change generationally. That's why the Irish are now considered just as American as anybody else. I would say when my family came to the United States, it wasn't particularly Jew-friendly, but I'm much more glad that they came there instead of staying in the Ukraine, because it's always better for people to be able to make a new life for themselves than it is for them to be forced to languish in a country that hates them, in a war-torn area, simply because there might be discrimination on the other side of the border. We find backlash arguments like this abhorrent. That's the exact same rhetoric used to justify segregation of schools because, you know, if you desegregate them, people might get mad. We don't think that is principally just, nor do we think it's even practically correct. There's no reason that stands. So, what do we tell you under why this is best for refugees? We already tell you why they think they decrease the number of refugees that are accepted. We ask them to finally engage with this, but we'd say it's coming a little late. First possibility we tell you is that people are left to languish on camps in the borders when they are not accepted. Why is this really, really bad? They can tell you camps still exist on our side of the house, but when people aren't granted asylum, there are more people in camps. Where has this been harmful? We'd say, for example, in the Congo, where militancy broke out in conflict, ending real lives, that's probably not something they should encourage for the purpose of xenophobia. But the second thing we tell you is often people are literally sent back to their home countries because no country will accept them. During World War II, a boat of Jewish refugees came to the United States. They were rejected and sent home. Literally all of them died. We would say that is encouraged on their side of the house when you can deny people the right to live, the right to resettle based on like your own arbitrary designations of identity. But third, we tell you often that means people are afraid to come in the first place because they're afraid to make the perilous journey to another country if they think they're going to be denied at the flip of the switch. Why, in the long run, does this make refugee policy worse? We tell you, first of all, it legitimates this form of denying refugees. The only people that are considered acceptable in that country anymore are the ones who look exactly like the people already in that. In the long run, that means you have less refugees, but second, we tell you, this is often an excuse to deny refugee entry because there is no exact metric you can have for cultural superiority. Thus, our countries can deny any refugee at the flip of the switch. But what is the next thing we bring to you? We bring to you that in the long run, you decrease cultural conflict. This encompasses our third argument and their second and third. Aditya brings this to you, they don't engage. What do we tell you? We tell you on their side of the house, you encourage xenophobia because there's no opportunity to learn about new people and to learn about new cultures. We would tell you, you are not going to make connections with refugees. We do not think people's shared music tastes and those experiences are based on identity alone. We think that when you let more refugees into a country, that is when you break down stereotypes. That is when you expand the view of what national identity means. We would say discrimination and stereotypes are only encouraged on their side of the house because there's no chance to disprove them. That is why we see media campaigns against native-born people who fit stereotypes, regardless of refugee status of them and the people around them, because discrimination exists against people because of their identities, not the refugee status alone. We do not believe you should legitimate hatred, and that is why we are proud to oppose.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes and 6 seconds.
My mother fled from war-torn Vietnam and received asylum in Canada. On side proposition, they would tell you that a country would have been justified in sending her back to a war-torn country that probably would have murdered her father because she looked and sounded different than people in that country. We fundamentally reject this reality, and we think that they have fundamentally failed to meet their burden of proving why this stance is justified and why it is best for her and for other refugees and for countries as a whole to pursue that policy. I'll be asking 2 questions in today's debate. Which side is best on principle and which is best on practical? Let's start with the principle because they're massively behind here, something they apparently recognize because they pretty much dropped the principle and stopped extending it after the first speech. Their entire idea was contingent on the state's right to judge certain refugees as more valuable than others based on their race and their culture. We think that this is just an illegitimate judgment. It is the that is, the United States killing a Mexican immigrant and denying them asylum because of the color of their skin. That is France denying asylum to a Syrian refugee because of their religion. That is Canada denying a Vietnamese refugee asylum because of the language that they speak. That is discrimination. Governments should never endorse or allow discrimination. And that, as a matter of principle, is an independent reason to vote for the opposition because we think that this is overriding, completely negates the principle that they apparently no longer have, and is an independent reason for you to sign an opposition ballot. That is just completely illegitimate for any democracy to pursue. But even though we win this debate on the principle, let's talk about the practical. Their best argument in the round, and the one that they actually think they win on, is the idea that we become more friendly to refugees when they look like us, and that increases immigration. We told you that this is just factually false. When countries like Hungary refuse to accept anybody but Christian refugees, that decreases the number of refugees that they accept. It distorts the cultural number of refugees that we accept because Christian refugees are just factually not the majority of refugees in the world. But furthermore, we also told you that we exclude and leave behind Yazidis and Vietnamese refugees and all other groups that don't fit the cultural norms of any other country. Are we justified, principally or practically, in telling these people to go back to a country where their lives are legitimately threatened? Are we justified, principally or practically, in telling them to languish in a refugee camp where their children are going to die from disease, where their women are going to be sexually assaulted? No, on absolutely no count. We think that it is much better to save these people's lives than to say, oh, because people are going to discriminate against you a little bit, we're going to completely discriminate against your ability to claim your right to life. But even if we accept them at their highest ground and tell you that, yes, this does increase sentiment towards refugees, we told you that that comes at a massive, massive cost because the xenophobia that they so condemn on their side of the house actually gets much worse. Why is this? Our third argument, which they kind of failed to engage with. We told you that when you legitimize this policy of making a value judgment based on someone's identity, that legitimizes right-wing sentiments that discriminate against minorities. It perpetuates, furthermore, a radical narrative of essentially minority groups feeling like they're being victimized and perpetuating even more violence. In our world, however, increased diversity increases tolerance. We see this in the United States with the Irish citizens that they actually brought up in a POI, interestingly. Those Irish people are now viewed as just as American. That's how you increase tolerance. But even if that weren't the case, even if there is backlash, Elisa brilliantly told you that backlash is never a reason not to pursue progress. Backlash is never a reason not to discriminate. We fundamentally believe that avoiding making a racist angry is not a reason to pursue racism in the first place. And because we overwhelmingly win this debate on the principle, and furthermore practically benefit all of the demographics that they and we advocate for, we're so proud to oppose.
Okay.
The previous speaker spent 4 minutes and 17 seconds.
Now, to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Mr. Bradley.
4 speeches in, opposition was still getting mad about the wrong debate. Because this debate was not about whether or not we would kick a Vietnamese refugee out of Canada. This debate was about if there were 2 refugees and Canada could only accept 1, is it okay that they choose the one that is going to live a better life? Is it okay that they choose the one that is going to allow the political aspirations of the people to accept more refugees in the future? The fact that they spent half of their time getting so mad about us being discriminatory and kicking people out meant that they lost this debate because they forgot about they forgot about the wording of the motion in itself. This debate was never about the fact that Western liberal democracies could choose not to accept Muslim people. This debate was about whether or not, when there was a surplus of refugees and they could only accept a certain amount, if it was far more beneficial that they were principally justified to accept the ones that would benefit their nation and benefit the causes that they wanted to support. So no matter how hard she slammed the table, it was never about us trying to discriminate and be racist. The problem that we identified from the first speech was that the hatred towards refugees was one that led to the abandonment and the political apathy towards these people. So even if, in their best case scenario, we say maybe you can break down some sort of stereotypes, maybe it is true that it is arbitrary the means by which you decide their future, but the fact that the political apathy continued on their side, regardless of what they did, meant that there was always going to be less refugees, and that is why we want this debate. But even though they changed their policy in their third speech, they decided to prioritize utility in their third speech, and they told us a whole new argument about states' responsibility to be a moral actor in their third speech. I'm going to show you why they still lost today's debate. Because firstly, on the principle, what did they tell us? They told you about arbitrariness, but they were never able to distinction why it is that when literally every way of choosing refugees is always going to be arbitrary, why this one was the worst type. Because we told you, the fact that one refugee made it on the boat and another one made on the later boat is still arbitrary, and it's still going to be discriminatory based off of your ability to just get on a boat. We didn't know why it is so that this sort of discrimination was so much worse, especially if it is possible that this leads to the benefit that the state can see in its own eyes. But secondly, when we brought to you the principle of sovereignty, we told you when there was a choice to be made and one of two refugees was going to have to go back, why it is important to choose the one that is going to benefit not only your state, but benefit the refugee themselves. This was something that they completely mischaracterized and never responded to. But second point on efficacy, who gets more refugees? Two things. Firstly, we told you that countries are more willing to take refugees on our side. The analogous comparison of Hungary is not that they take Christians on our side and they take everyone on theirs. The analogous comparison is that they take refugees on our side and they don't take any on theirs. Even if it is going to be a homogenized population, taking refugees is better than not. But secondly, we told you why the political apathy will be deconstructed. When people are no longer angry at the fact that they are a refugee, even if you don't break down social barriers, we told you that if they were more willing to accept the policy of accepting more refugees, this meant that more people can get saved. They told us two things. Firstly, they told us that this breaks cultural barrier, but they never responded to Matt's analysis on why it is so that cultural dissonance meant that this was almost impossible. And the point at which they tell you that backlash does not matter means that they ignore the fact that even if there's going to be less refugees on their side, they decide to ignore. We think that's highly problematic when the whole entire point of this debate was to try to save more refugees on the long term. But secondly, they once again told us about this discrimination policy, which was not even relevant to the debate as a whole. But still, we told you firstly that prioritization does not mean you take in less refugees. Often it means that you might even be willing to take in more refugees, but importantly, when you had to make a choice, you would much rather make the choice that would benefit the state, that would benefit the political will to take in more refugees. Importantly, today's debate was about how we could save more refugees on the future. We destroyed the political apathy that meant nobody was willing to, and they perpetuated that apathy. They never saved more refugees, and we are so proud to propose.